The Arizona sun beat down on the Blackwater tactical range like a sledgehammer, turning the desert air into a shimmering wall of heat. This wasn't some weekend warrior playground. This was where the pros came to prove themselves. Reserve officers, competitive marksmen, and wealthy gun enthusiasts with more money than sense all gathered here, chasing the dream of becoming a true sharpshooter. Rachel Thompson stepped out of her dusty Honda Civic, squinting against the glare. At 28, she looked like she'd wandered in from a different world. Her faded gray t-shirt hung loose from too many wash cycles. Her jeans were worn thin at the knees, and her boots had seen better decades. No tactical vest, no high-end gear, no swagger, just a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and an old Remington rifle that had clearly seen its share of battles. The weapon check zone buzzed with testosterone and bragging rights. Shooters clustered around tables, showing off their toys like peacocks displaying their feathers. Rifles gleamed with custom finishes. Scopes cost more than most people's cars, and everyone tossed around technical terms like they were speaking a foreign language designed to exclude outsiders. Rachel found a spot at the edge of the chaos, setting her scarred rifle on a folding table that looked like it had survived a war. She pulled out a cloth that was nearly as old as her gun and began the familiar ritual of cleaning her barrel. Her movements were smooth, practiced, almost meditative. "Check out the lost tourist," sneered a guy with a military buzz cut and a scope that probably cost $3,000. His name tag read Brandon, and he wore it like a badge of honor. He nudged his buddy, a stocky man in a logoed polo shirt. "Bet she's here by mistake. Probably followed the wrong GPS directions." His friend, whose name tag read Kyle, popped his gum and smirked. "What's she gonna do? Pose for Instagram with that museum piece? My grandpa's got one just like it rusting in his garage." Rachel's fingers never paused in their steady work. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the laughter rippling through the crowd. She just kept cleaning, her hands calm and sure, like she was tending to something sacred. A woman approached, her tactical boots polished to a mirror shine. Commander Jessica Hayes, according to her name tag, carried herself with the kind of authority that came from years of ordering people around. Her rifle was a work of art, carbon fiber stock, digital scope, every bell and whistle money could buy. "You're embarrassing yourself," Hayes said, her voice loud enough to draw every eye in the vicinity. "This camp is for serious shooters, not some charity case with a hand-me-down gun." She leaned in closer, her lips curling into something that might have been a smile if it wasn't so cold. "Why don't you save us all the trouble and leave before you make a complete fool of yourself?" The crowd ate it up. A few people actually clapped, like they were watching a performance. Rachel's fingers tightened on the cloth for just a moment, so brief you might have missed it, then relaxed. She slid the bolt back, checked the chamber with practiced ease, and set the rifle down with the kind of care you'd show a sleeping child. Hayes huffed and turned away, but her words hung in the air like smoke, stinging and persistent. The damage was done. The crowd had their entertainment, and Rachel was the punchline. A young trainer, barely out of his 20s, strutted by with a clipboard and the kind of swagger that came from having just enough authority to be dangerous. His radio crackled on his hip like a prop in a movie. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, making sure everyone within 50 yards could hear. "You sure you're in the right place? This ain't no Instagram convention." The laughter that followed was sharp and mean, designed to cut. A woman in a tight tactical jacket, her nails painted blood red, gave Rachel a slow once-over that was somehow more insulting than any words could have been. "Those boots," she muttered to her friend, a blonde, whose outfit looked like it came straight from a military surplus catalog. "My dad's got a pair just like them in his closet, from when he was in high school." "And that gun," the blonde replied, wrinkling her nose. I've seen better weapons at garage sales. Rachel's hand paused on the bolt for half a heartbeat, then slid it back with a soft, final click. She gave a small nod to herself. It seemed, and set the rifle down, the metal cool against her palm despite the desert heat. But something in her stillness, in the way she moved with such quiet precision, caught the attention of one person in the crowd. A grizzled senior instructor with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much stood watching from the shadows. His name tag read Sergeant Major Collins, and unlike the others, he wasn't laughing. He was remembering. The reflex test was designed to separate the wheat from the chaff. 3 moving targets, 5 seconds to drop them all. Miss one, and you were. Done. No second chances, no excuses. Rachel watched as shooter after shooter stepped up to the line. Most of them were good, really good. But good wasn't perfect, and the moving targets were unforgiving. Steel plates danced left and right, mocking the marksman who couldn't quite keep up. Commander Hayes went first, her custom rifle tracking smoothly. She dropped 2 targets clean, but the third one slipped past her. The crowd murmured sympathetically, like she'd been robbed by bad luck rather than skill. Damn wind, Hayes muttered, adjusting her scope like the equipment was to blame. Brandon stepped up next, his expensive optics glinting. He managed to tag all 3 targets, but his time was nearly 8 seconds. Still, the crowd cheered like he'd just won the Olympics. Not bad for a warm-up, he said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder with practiced nonchalance. One by one, they cycled through. Some cursed the conditions. Others blamed their equipment. A few just shrugged and tried to play it off like it didn't matter. But Rachel could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands tightened on their weapons when they thought no one was looking. Then it was her turn. Rachel stepped up to the line, her boots scuffing the hard-packed dirt. Her stance was relaxed but rooted, like she was part of the landscape itself. The Remington looked almost ancient in her hands, its wooden stock scarred and worn smooth by countless hours of use. The young trainer with the clipboard looked at her with barely concealed disdain. "You ready for this, sweetheart?" "It's a lot harder than it looks on YouTube." Rachel didn't answer. She just shouldered her rifle and waited. The buzzer blared. 3 targets erupted into motion, darting left and right in patterns designed to confuse and frustrate. Rachel's rifle moved like it was connected to her thoughts, smooth, flowing, inevitable. Crack, crack, crack. All 3 targets dropped in perfect sequence, the steel plates ringing like bells as they fell. The echo faded into absolute silence. The range went dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sergeant Major Collins checked his stopwatch, then checked it again. His face had gone pale beneath his tan. 4.3 seconds, he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. All targets down. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Then someone in the crowd let out a low whistle, not mocking this time, but something closer to awe. "That technique," Collins muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The way she shifted her weight, the breathing pattern ... He trailed off, his eyes narrowing as he studied Rachel's face. But the moment of stunned silence couldn't last. Egos like the ones gathered here didn't stay quiet for long. A shooter, in a black tactical cap, his rifle adorned with enough accessories to stock a small armory, broke the spell with a sharp, mocking whistle. "Beginner's luck doesn't win wars," he called out, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think 3 shots make you a sniper? Go back to your knitting, lady." The crowd latched onto his words like a lifeline, their laughter returning with a vengeance. They needed to believe it was luck, needed to maintain the natural order of things where expensive gear and loud confidence mattered more than quiet skill. Rachel adjusted her stance, her eyes flicking to the fallen targets and then back to her rifle. She pulled a small tool from her bag and made a minute adjustment to her scope. A tiny click that somehow seemed to cut through the noise. The trainers. Words hung in the air, but she didn't respond. Instead, she ran her thumb over the rifle stock, where a faint scratch marked the wood. It was an old mark, deliberate and precise, like a signature carved by someone who understood the weight of leaving their mark on the world. Collins caught the gesture, and his fingers began to twitch like he was piecing together a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for years. There was something about that mark, something familiar. But before he could voice his thoughts, the crowd's whispers grew louder. The natural order had been disrupted, and they were desperate to restore it. Lucky shot. A man in a designer. Tactical vest muttered, his voice sour with disappointment. Beginner's luck? Another agreed, adjusting his scope like it was a talisman against the impossible. The buzz-cut shooter Brandon snorted loud enough for everyone to hear. Doesn't mean she's any good. Probably practiced that one trick for weeks. Wait until she has to do some real shooting. Rachel pulled a water bottle from her bag. The plastic was scratched and faded, the cap worn smooth by countless uses. She took a sip, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. The trainer with the clipboard walked by again, slower this time, his eyes flicking between Rachel and his notes. He didn't say anything, but his fingers tightened on his pen like he was restraining himself from writing something down. The laughter didn't let up. If anything, it got sharper, more desperate. They needed to tear her down, needed to prove that what they just witnessed was nothing more than a fluke. Because if it wasn't luck, if it was skill ... that would change everything. The precision test was the camp's crown jewel, a 1,000-meter shot that separated the professionals from the pretenders. The shooters gathered around the main observation, tent-like pilgrims at a shrine, their voices buzzing with nervous energy and forced confidence. Rachel stood apart from the group, seeking shade under a scraggly mesquite tree. Its branches cast jagged shadows across her face as she worked, cleaning her scope with the same methodical precision she'd shown with everything else. Her canvas bag slumped at her feet, looking as worn and weathered as its owner. The guy in the camo hat, his name tag read Derek, couldn't let it go. His tactical watch caught the sun like a mirror as he gestured toward Rachel. "She's still here," he said to his buddy, his voice pitched to carry. "Thought she'd have packed up and run home crying by now." His friend, a lanky guy with a carefully groomed goatee, laughed on cue. "Maybe she's waiting for a participation trophy. Poor thing probably doesn't even know she's out of her league." But it was the older man who really twisted the knife. He looked to be in his 50s, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his gear was immaculate, the kind of equipment that cost more than most people made in a month. He approached Rachel's spot under the tree with the swagger of someone who'd never been told no. "You're wasting everyone's time," he said, his voice low and venomous. His eyes bored into her, like he was trying to will her out of existence. "This is a professional range, not a playground for wannabes. Pack up and go before you humiliate yourself any further." He gestured at her rifle with obvious disgust. "That thing belongs in a museum, not on a firing line." Several nearby shooters nodded their agreement, their smirks spreading like an infection. They fed off his cruelty, drawing strength from the pack mentality that made them feel safe in their superiority. Rachel's hand paused on the cloth, her fingers curling slightly. She looked up at him, her eyes steady and unflinching, then went back to cleaning her scope. Her movements remained unchanged, but something in her silence seemed to unnerve him. The man scoffed and turned away, but his words had drawn more attention. The crowd was gathering, sensing blood in the water. That's when help came from an unexpected source. A kid maybe 16, hauling a water jug that looked bigger than he was stopped near Rachel's tree. His t-shirt was soaked with sweat, his arms thin but strong from lugging supplies all day. He was one of the camp volunteers, the kind of kid who was invisible to most of the paying customers. "You're pretty good," he said, his voice soft and hesitant, almost swallowed by the noise of the gathering crowd. Rachel looked up, her eyes guarded but kind, like she was weighing whether to trust this small gesture of kindness in a sea of hostility. "Thanks," she said, her voice low and steady. The kid shifted his weight, glancing nervously at the crowd of expensive shooters. "My dad used to talk about a sniper called Ghost Viper," he said carefully, like he was sharing a secret. "Said he could hit anything, anywhere. Nobody knew his real name, but he was a legend." Rachel's hands stilled on the cloth for just a moment, her fingers curling slightly. She nodded once, then went back to her scope, her movements unchanged but her jaw a fraction tighter. The kid lingered like he wanted to say more, then shuffled off, the water jug sloshing in his hands. But his words had been heard by more than just Rachel. Sergeant Major Collins, who'd been watching from the shadows, felt something click into place in his mind. Ghost Viper. The name stirred old memories, classified briefings, whispered legends from the special operations community. A sniper so skilled, so deadly, that his existence was more myth than reality. The event official, a woman in her 40s with a headset, and the kind of authority that came from running military-grade operations, stepped up to announce the finalists. Her voice crackled through the speakers, sharp and businesslike. "Only the top 12 proceed to the 1,000-meter challenge," she announced, her eyes scanning the crowd with professional detachment. She read off names, each one met with nods, claps, or smug grins from the shooters who'd made the cut. Rachel waited, her face impassive, but her fingers had tightened slightly on her rifle. Then the official paused, her finger tapping against her clipboard. "Sorry, Thompson. Your scores were fine, but we need candidates with proven track records." The word proven landed like a slap, heavy with condescension and judgment. Rachel hadn't just been cut. She'd been dismissed as unworthy, despite having just delivered the most impressive performance of the day. A guy in the back, his rifle slung over his shoulder like a badge of honor, couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Let the amateur go home," he called out, his voice carrying across the range. Another voice, softer but somehow crueler, whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "They don't want her embarrassing the group." Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't argue or plead or make a scene. She simply slung her rifle over her shoulder, the strap worn and frayed from years of use, and walked back to her tree. Her steps were slow and unhurried, like she was walking through a memory rather than a moment of public humiliation. Under the mesquite, she sat cross-legged, her bag open beside her. She pulled out a small tin of gun oil, its label long gone, the metal dented from years of faithful service. Her fingers worked the cloth with a rhythm that felt almost sacred, like she was tending to something alive. Two shooters walked past, their voices low but clear. "She's got to be humiliated," one said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I'd have left by now if I were her." The other snorted, adjusting his tactical gloves with practiced precision. "She's either too stubborn or too stupid to know she's outclassed." Rachel's eyes stayed on her work, but her jaw tightened just enough to notice. She set the bolt down and picked up a round, holding it to the light like it held secrets only she could read. Her fingers moved with deliberate care, like she was holding on to something the rest of them couldn't see. The camp kept moving around. The finalists preparing for their moment of glory. But everything was about to change. One of the lead shooters, a cocky guy with sponsor logos covering his vest like NASCAR, decals slipped on a loose rock during a practice run. He hit the ground hard, his shoulder twisting with a sound that made everyone in earshot wince. The medics swarmed in, their radios crackling with urgent chatter. The range master, a grizzled veteran who'd seen his share of injuries, shook his head grimly. Dislocated shoulder. He's out. The crowd tensed, whispers spreading like wildfire. They were one shooter short for the main event. Collins scanned the group of eliminated shooters, his eyes sharp under the brim of his cap. They landed on Rachel, still sitting under her tree, still tending to her rifle with that same methodical precision. "Thompson," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You're up." The finalist tent was a different world, a shrine to high-tech gear and higher egos. Tables lined with rifles that gleamed like show cars, scopes with digital displays, tripods adjusted to mathematical precision. The air was thick with gun oil, nervous sweat, and the kind of testosterone that came from men who'd spent more on their equipment than most people spent on their cars. Rachel set her Remington down, its wooden stock scarred and worn, and the snickers started immediately. Travis Kellerman, a shooter with a slick haircut and a rifle that cost more than most people's annual salary, leaned back in his chair with a grin that was all teeth and no warmth. His name tag identified him as a former Marine, but his attitude screamed entitled civilian. "You're in over your head, kid," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This ain't a hobbyist game. This is where the real shooters separate themselves from the wannabes." An older guy with a thick beard and a scar running across his left cheek, his name tag read Marcus, grinned with cold amusement. "What's with the thrift store look? You borrow that gun from your grandfather's attic?" Rachel didn't respond. She checked her ammunition with the same steady rhythm she'd shown all day, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The taunts were just background noise now, like wind rustling through leaves. Commander Hayes, the woman who'd tried to humiliate her earlier, watched from the sidelines with the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing someone get their comeuppance. "She's going to crash and burn," she said to her friend, a blonde she's going to crash and burn. Tactical outfit looked like it came from a high-end catalog. Look at her, no preparation, no professional gear. Just walking in here like she belongs with the rest of us. Travis laughed, the sound loud and performative. "Bet she's never even been to a real range before today. Probably learned to shoot in some backyard with beer cans and dreams." Rachel slid around into the chamber, the click sharp and definitive in the tense air. She looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Travis's for just a split-second, calm, steady, but with something underneath that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. That's when Travis decided to push it further. He stood up, his grin widening, making sure every head in the tent turned his way. "I got a proposition for you, miss. Whatever your name is," he said, his voice carrying across the space like a challenge. $10,000 says you can't hit a target at 800 meters using a convex mirror backward shot. You game?" The tent erupted in laughter. Guys hooting and slapping their thighs, women smirking behind their hands. It was the kind of bet that was designed to be impossible, meant to expose Rachel as the fraud they all believed her to be. Hayes crossed her arms, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "She's not that stupid. Even she has to know when she's beaten." Rachel set her rifle down with deliberate care. She looked at Travis, her eyes steady and almost curious, like she was seeing through him to something deeper. "I'm in," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. The laughter stopped for a heartbeat, then roared back louder than before. They could smell blood in the water now, and the feeding frenzy was about to begin. As Rachel walked toward the side range where the mirror shot would take place, a group of shooters followed like hyenas trailing a wounded animal. Kyle, the guy with the buzz cut who'd called her a tourist, stepped directly into her path, holding up his phone to record. "Smile for the fail reel," he sneered, his camera angled to catch her face. "This is going viral when you miss." Budget sniper flops at pro camp. #pathetic. The crowd roared their approval, some pulling out their own phones, their lenses glinting like predators' eyes in the desert sun. Rachel's fingers tightened on her rifle, her knuckles going pale for just a moment. Then she stepped past him, her shoulder brushing his arm, and kept walking. The mirror shot setup drew a crowd like a public execution. The target was 800 meters out, a steel plate, no bigger than a dinner plate, glinting in the harsh Arizona sun. The convex mirror was propped on a stand, its surface scratched but functional, angled to give her a backward view of the target. Travis handed her the mirror with a mocking bow, his grin so smug it was almost painful to witness. "Good luck, sweetheart. Try not to hit anything important when you miss." Rachel took the mirror, her fingers brushing its edge with the same care she'd shown her rifle. She adjusted her stance, checked her optics, and raised the weapon. Her movements were precise, almost delicate, like she was performing surgery rather than attempting an impossible shot. The crowd hushed, their phones out and ready to capture the inevitable failure. Even the most experienced shooters in the group couldn't imagine making this shot. It was the kind of thing that existed only in movies and tall tales. Rachel angled the shot, her body perfectly still, her breath steady and controlled. The mirror showed her the target, but reversed, distorted, making the already difficult shot nearly impossible. Then she fired. The sound cracked across the range like thunder. The monitor lit up instantly. Bullseye, dead center. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear individual heartbeats. The crowd stood frozen, their phones still recording, their mouths hanging open like they'd just witnessed something that defied the laws of physics. A retired veteran at the back of the crowd, his cap pulled low over eyes that had seen too much, muttered something that made several nearby shooters go pale. Only Ghost Viper could have taught that kind of precision. Sergeant Major Collins stepped closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing at the data displayed on the screen. He tapped the readout, then turned to Rachel, his voice low but urgent. "Enough to carry to the nearest shooters." "That shot wasn't luck," he said, his words cutting through the stunned silence. "The angle, the timing, the compensation for the mirror distortion. It's textbook Viper technique. Where'd you learn that?" The crowd shifted, some leaning in to hear better, others frowning as their certainty began to crumble. Rachel adjusted. A rifle, her fingers brushing that same faint notch on the stock, a mark that seemed too deliberate to be random. She didn't answer Collins's question. She just gave a small nod, to herself more than anyone else, and stepped back from the firing line. But the damage was done. The natural order had been shattered, and there was no putting it back together. The silence after the impossible shot didn't last long. Egos like the ones gathered at Blackwater Tactical didn't stay quiet when their entire worldview had been challenged. By the time the 1,000-meter challenge approached, the taunts were back sharper, more desperate, edged with something that might have been fear. Marcus Hendricks, the burly ex-Marine with the scar across his cheek, couldn't let it go. His arms were crossed over his chest, his voice booming across the range like a foghorn. "You think you're hot stuff now, huh?" he called out, positioning himself directly in Rachel's path. "One fluke shot doesn't make you a sniper. I've got a challenge for you real shooters only." His name tag identified him as a former Force Recon Marine, and he wore that identity like armor. One shot, one target. Fastest and most accurate wins. You game, or are you going to hide behind that lucky shot like all the other pretenders? The crowd started chanting, their voices rising like a mob calling for blood. "Duel! Duel! Duel!" Rachel looked at him, her face calm, her hands steady on her rifle. There was something in her eyes, not fear, not anger, but a kind of quiet certainty that made Marcus's grin falter for just a moment. "I'm in," she said, her voice soft but carrying absolute conviction. The crowd went wild. This was what they'd been waiting for, a chance to see the upstart brought down, to restore the natural order where expensive gear and loud confidence mattered more than quiet skill. Just before the duel began, Commander Hayes made one last attempt to break Rachel's composure. She leaned into Rachel's personal space, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You're a fraud," she hissed, her words meant to cut deep. "Everyone here knows you're faking it. You'll choke when it matters, and we'll all be here to watch you fall apart like the amateur you are." She flicked her wrist, tossing a crumpled range pass at Rachel's feet. The paper landed in the dust like a piece of garbage, and several people in the crowd snickered at the gesture. Rachel's gaze dropped to the pass, her fingers tightening briefly on her rifle. Then she bent down, picked up the paper, and tucked it into her pocket with deliberate care. Her movement was slow, methodical, like she was filing away a memory for later use. When she straightened, her eyes met Hayes's for a moment, calm, steady, but with something underneath that made the commander take an involuntary step back. The duel was set for the main range. The crowd packed in tight, their breath held, their phones out and ready. The target was a human silhouette at 1,000 meters, with a small circle marking the left eye. The rules were brutally simple. First, to hit the eye wins. Marcus set up with a flourish, his rifle gleaming in the afternoon sun. His movements were all show, adjusting his position, checking his scope, making sure everyone could see how professional he was. He'd been waiting for this moment, the chance to put this pretender in her place. Rachel stood off to the side, her Remington resting against her hip, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon like she was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. The rangemaster raised his hand. "Shooters ready?" Marcus nodded, his jaw tight with concentration. Rachel gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible. The buzzer sounded. The target popped up. Before Marcus could even begin to acquire his target, Rachel's rifle cracked with sharp finality. The sound echoed across the range like a judgment. The monitor flashed immediately. Clean shot. Left EYE time. 0.9 seconds. Marcus's hands froze on his weapon, his mouth hanging open. His expensive rifle, his years of training, his military background, none of it mattered. He'd been beaten before he'd even begun the fight. Rachel lowered her rifle, her eyes still fixed on the horizon like she hadn't even noticed the crowds. Stunned silence. She might as well have been target shooting in her backyard for all the emotion she showed. Collins stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "She was trained by Ghost Viper," he announced, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "And he only had one student." The crowd stood frozen, their certainty shattered, their phones still recording a moment that would change everything they thought they knew about shooting. That's when the pieces began falling into place. A retired colonel, his uniform crisp, despite the desert heat, approached. Rachel with the measured stride of someone who'd spent decades in command. His eyes were sharp with recognition as he held out a faded photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. "This was taken 20 years ago," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The photo showed a younger man in sniper gear, standing beside a rifle that looked remarkably familiar right down to the deliberate notch carved into the stock. "Ghost Viper's final training session," the colonel continued, his gaze never leaving Rachel's face. "That mark on your rifle, it's his signature. He carved it into the weapon of his only student before he disappeared." Rachel's fingers brushed the stock where that same mark sat, faint but unmistakable. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then handed it back to the colonel with a small nod. The colonel's weathered face softened, like he'd found a piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for decades. "I knew your teacher," he said quietly. "Best sniper I ever had the privilege to serve with. The crowd didn't know how to handle this revelation. Some stared with their mouths open, their expensive rifles suddenly feeling like toys in their hands. Others looked away, their faces tight with embarrassment and wounded pride. Travis muttered something under his breath, but his voice was weak, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Hayes had already slipped away, her face pale, her confident swagger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like shame. Marcus just stood there, his glove still on the ground where he'd thrown it in preparation for the duel, his shoulders slumped in defeat. But Rachel didn't gloat or celebrate. She simply walked back to her table, packed her gear with the same methodical precision she'd shown all day, and prepared to leave, as if the world hadn't just shifted under everyone's feet. The legend of Ghost Viper was real, and she was his legacy. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Ghost Viper's student. The legendary sniper who'd been a myth, a whispered story told in special operations circles, had trained someone. And that someone was standing right here, holding a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. The camp's hierarchy began to crumble as the truth sank in. The shooters, who'd spent thousands on their gear, who'd bragged about their military service and competitive records, suddenly found themselves face to face with someone who represented a level of skill they'd only dreamed of reaching. Rachel didn't acknowledge the stares or the whispers. She simply continued her methodical preparation, cleaning her rifle with the same reverence she'd shown all day. But others were beginning to take notice. The right kind of people. Colonel James Morrison, the camp's senior advisor and a man whose opinion carried weight in military circles, approached Rachel's station with the kind of respect he usually reserved for fellow officers. "Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet range, "I served with Ghost Viper in Afghanistan. Operation Silent Thunder, 2003. He saved my entire unit with a shot that shouldn't have been possible." He paused, his eyes studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "He told me once that he'd found someone worthy of his knowledge. Someone who understood that true marksmanship wasn't about the equipment. It was about becoming one with the weapon." Rachel looked up from her rifle, her eyes meeting his steadily. "He was a good teacher," she said simply. Morrison nodded, then turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. "For those of you who don't understand what you just witnessed," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command, Ghost Viper was classified as a strategic asset. His confirmed kills are still classified, but I can tell you that entire enemy operations were canceled just because intelligence suggested he might be in the area. The crowd was dead silent now, hanging on every word. The shot you just saw hitting a target at 800 meters using a mirror, that's not just skill. That's a technique that exists nowhere in any manual, any training program. It was developed by one man for one purpose, to make impossible shots possible. Travis, who'd been growing paler by the minute, finally found his voice. "May you too, but that's impossible. No one can just. Nothing is impossible when you've been taught by the best." Morrison cut him off. Ghost Viper didn't just teach marksmanship. He taught a philosophy, a way of thinking about shooting that transcends equipment and ego. Commander Hayes, who'd been watching from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. Her earlier confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like desperation. "This is all very interesting," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "But we have protocols here. Standards. We can't just what?" Morrison's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Can't recognize excellence when it's standing right in front of you? Can't admit that maybe, just maybe, you've been measuring the wrong things?" The crowd began to shift, the social dynamics that had seemed so solid an hour ago now crumbling like sand. Some of the shooters were looking at their expensive gear with new eyes, wondering if they'd been chasing the wrong dream all along. Others were looking at Rachel with a mixture of awe and resentment, unable to reconcile what they'd witnessed with their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. A young camp staffer approached Morrison with trembling hands, carrying a weathered logbook that looked like it had survived decades of storage. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I found this in the archives. It's from Ghost Viper's final training session." Morrison took the book carefully, his fingers tracing the yellowed pages. He found what he was looking for and held it up for the crowd to see. There, in faded but unmistakable handwriting, was an entry that made several people gasp. Rachel Thompson, final student, certification, complete, legacy secured, GV. The girl pointed to a note scrawled in the margin. Natural talent exceeds instructor capability. Recommend immediate classification change to strategic asset level. Morrison's voice was heavy with respect as he read the final line aloud. Student demonstrates abilities that surpass current military standards. Training complete. She is ready. The silence that followed was deafening. This wasn't just about one impressive shot anymore. This was documented proof that Rachel Thompson was the heir to a legend that most of them had thought was just a story. Travis sank into a chair, his $10,000 bet suddenly seeming like the least of his problems. Marcus was staring at his hands like he'd never seen them before. Hayes had gone completely white, the implications of her earlier behavior finally hitting home. But it was the young volunteer, the kid who'd mentioned Ghost Viper's name, who broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of everyone's confusion. "If you're that good," he asked Rachel, his voice filled with genuine curiosity, "why didn't you say anything? Why let them treat you like that?" Rachel looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet wisdom that made everyone lean in to hear. "My teacher told me that true strength doesn't need to announce itself," she said. "The loudest voice in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. Sometimes the best thing you can do is let people show you exactly who they are." Her eyes swept across the crowd, taking in the faces of those who had mocked her, dismissed her, tried to humiliate her. "Besides," she added with the ghost of a smile, "there's something to be said for exceeding expectations." The camp director, a retired general named Patricia Williams, had been watching the entire situation unfold from her office overlooking the range. When word reached her about the Ghost Viper connection, she made a decision that would change everything. "Attention all personnel," her voice crackled over the camp's PA system. "All shooters and staff report to the main pavilion immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." The crowd gathered under the large canvas tent, the mood tense and uncertain. Rachel stood off to the side, her rifle case slung over her shoulder, looking like she was ready to leave at any moment. General Williams took the makeshift stage, her presence commanding instant silence. "I've been running tactical training camps for 15 years, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded troops in multiple theaters. "In that time, I've seen thousands of shooters come through these ranges. Some good, some exceptional, a few truly gifted." She paused, her eyes finding Rachel in the crowd. "But I've never seen anything like what happened here today." Travis shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening cooling. "General, with all due respect, we followed protocols. The woman didn't meet our stated requirements for—" "What requirements?" Williams's voice cut through his, excuse like a blade. "The requirement to have expensive equipment? To wear the right clothes? To fit into your preconceived notions of what a shooter should look like." She stepped down from the stage, walking directly toward the group of shooters who had been loudest in their mockery. Or maybe the requirement was to show proper respect for a skill level that none of you will ever achieve. Commander Hayes stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, This is ridiculous. One good shot doesn't erase the fact that she doesn't belong here. Look at her no military background, no competitive record, no professional credentials. No credentials? Morrison's voice was ice cold as he stood up from his seat. Let me tell you about credentials, Commander. He pulled out his phone and made a call, putting it on speaker for everyone to hear. Pentagon Archives. This is Colonel Morrison. Authorization code Delta 77 Alpha. I need confirmation on a classified training program, codenamed Silent Eagle. The voice that came through the speaker was crisp and official. Colonel Morrison, what specific information do you require? I need confirmation of graduation status for Rachel Thompson, trained under the Ghost Viper program. Completion date approximately 2018. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Then, confirmed, sir. Subject Thompson completed advanced sniper training with highest honors. Classification level, strategic asset. Current status, active reserve, highest clearance level. The tent went dead silent. Strategic asset. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Hayes' face went ashen. Strategic. But that means ... It means, Williams said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, that Miss Thompson holds a security clearance higher than anyone in this tent. It means that when her country needs the absolute best, they call her. She turned to face the crowd, her expression hard as granite. And it means that every single person who mocked her, dismissed her, or treated her with disrespect just showed their true character to someone who could end careers with a single phone call. Travis stood up, his hands shaking. We didn't. No? How could we have known? Rachel spoke for the first time since the revelation, her voice calm and steady. You couldn't have known about my background, she said. But you knew I could shoot. You saw what I could do, and instead of showing respect for the skill, you chose mockery and cruelty. She looked around the tent, her gaze touching on each person who had wronged her. You didn't need to know who trained me to treat me with basic human decency. Marcus, the Marine who had challenged her to the duel, stood up slowly. His face was red with shame, his voice barely above a whisper. Ma'am, there's no excuse for how I acted. I let my ego override my judgment. Your ego, Rachel repeated, her voice carrying a note of disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. Is that what you think this is about? She stepped forward, her presence suddenly seeming to fill the entire tent. Every person here claims to respect the military, to honor the sacrifice of those who serve. But when faced with someone who doesn't fit your image of what a warrior should look like, you choose mockery over respect. Hayes tried to interrupt, but Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger. I've served my country in ways that will never be public knowledge. I've made shots that saved lives, eliminated threats that you'll never read about in the news. And I did it all without needing to announce my credentials or demand recognition. She pulled the crumpled range pass from her pocket, the one Hayes had thrown at her feet in contempt, and held it up for everyone to see. You threw this at me like I was garbage, she said, her eyes locking onto Hayes's. But you know what? This piece of paper has more integrity than anything you've shown today. The commander's face crumpled, the weight of her actions finally hitting home. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Completely wrong. Sorry doesn't fix character, Rachel replied simply. It just reveals it came too late. Williams stepped back onto the stage, her voice carrying final authority. There will be consequences for what happened here today. This camp's reputation depends on treating all shooters with respect, regardless of their appearance or equipment. She looked directly at Travis. Your bet was not only inappropriate, it was potentially disastrous. You challenged a strategic asset to prove herself for your entertainment. Travis was visibly sweating now. General, I'll withdraw the bet. The whole thing was, the bet stands, Rachel said quietly, cutting him off. $10,000. You lost fair and square. She shouldered her rifle case and walked toward the tent exit, then paused and turned back to face the stunned crowd. The money goes to the camp's scholarship fund, she said. Maybe it'll help train the next generation to be better than this one. 3 hours later, the Blackwater Tactical Range was a different place. Word had spread beyond the camp, and Rachel's phone had been buzzing with calls from military contacts, competitive shooting organizations, and training facilities around the country. She sat in General Williams's office, a cup of coffee growing, cold in her hands, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and red. I owe you an apology, Williams said, settling into the chair across from her. My people should never have treated you that way. The culture here, it got toxic, and I allowed it to happen, Rachel shrugged. Every organization has its problems. The question is what you do about them. I'm making changes, Williams said firmly. Hayes is being transferred. Travis and Marcus are banned from the camp permanently, and I'm implementing new protocols about respect and conduct. Through the window, they could see Travis loading his gear into his truck, his movements dejected and hurried. His sponsors had already been calling word traveled fast in the shooting community, and being humiliated by a Ghost Viper student wasn't the kind of publicity anyone wanted to be associated with. Marcus had stayed longer, seeking Rachel out to offer a more sincere apology. His military pride had been wounded, but his military honor demanded he face his mistake head-on. I've been thinking about what you said, he told her. About character. I served 3 tours. Thought that gave me the right to judge others. But character isn't about where you've been. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching. Rachel had nodded, accepting his words without offering easy forgiveness. Some lessons had to be earned through action, not just words. Hayes had been a different story. The commander had left without another word. Her career prospects in the civilian shooting world effectively ended. In a community where reputation was everything, being exposed as someone who would mock a strategic asset was career suicide. Now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel felt the familiar peace that came with a job completed. She'd come here to practice, to keep her skills sharp in case her country called again. She hadn't expected to teach a lesson in humility. But sometimes, the most important missions were the ones you didn't plan for. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from the Pentagon. A simple text. Training camp performance noted. Well done. Stand ready. She smiled and deleted the message. Some things were better left unrecorded. General Williams walked her to her car, the old Honda Civic looking even more humble next to the expensive trucks and SUVs filling the parking lot. Will you come back? Williams asked. Rachel considered the question, her hand on the car door. Maybe. Depends on whether you really change things here. I will. You have my word. Rachel nodded and got into her car. As she drove away from the camp, she could see groups of shooters in her rearview mirror, still talking in animated clusters about what they'd witnessed. Some would learn from today. They'd go home and examine their own attitudes, maybe become better people for having their worldview challenged. Others would find ways to rationalize what had happened, to preserve their egos by diminishing what they'd seen. They'd tell themselves that equipment and credentials mattered more than character. That respect had to be earned through the right channels. But a few, just a few, would understand the real lesson. That true strength didn't need to announce itself. That the quiet person in the corner might be the most dangerous one in the room. That character was revealed not in moments of triumph, but in how you treated people you thought were beneath you. As Rachel drove through the desert night, she thought about her teacher's final words to her. The greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, it's making them defeat themselves. Today, she hadn't fired a single shot in anger. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or assert her authority. She'd simply let people show their true selves, and in the end, that had been more devastating than any weapon. Her phone rang one more time as she reached the highway. The caller ID showed a number. She recognized another Ghost Viper student, one of the very few who shared her unique training. "Saw the news," the voice said when she answered. "Heard you reminded some people why they should mind their manners." Rachel smiled, the first genuine smile she'd allowed herself all day. Sometimes people need reminding that the quiet ones are the ones you should worry about. Think they learned? Rachel glanced in her rearview mirror one last time, seeing the lights of the camp growing smaller in the distance. Some of them, that's enough. As she drove home through the desert night, Rachel Thompson, student of legends, keeper of secrets, and master of the impossible shot, disappeared back into the quiet life she'd chosen. But somewhere out there, in shooting ranges and tactical training camps across the country, people would tell the story of the day a simple woman with an old rifle reminded an entire community what respect really meant. And maybe, just maybe, the next person who walked onto a range without expensive gear or flashy credentials would be treated a little differently because of it. Some victories, Rachel knew, weren't measured in targets hit or competitions won. They were measured in moments of humanity, in the choice to see the person behind the equipment, and in the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd made the world just a little bit better. The desert highway stretched ahead, dark and empty, leading her home to a life where being ordinary was the greatest disguise of all. For everyone who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or judged by their appearance, your moment is coming. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in proving yourself to those who doubt you, but in staying true to who you are regardless of their opinions. Real respect isn't demanded. It's earned through character, not credentials. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.